Tasha Williams had worked hard to get where she was. She had earned her spot as an FBI agent through years of rigorous training, dedication, and a fierce determination to serve her country. She had faced challenges throughout her career, but she had always met them head-on, earning the respect of her colleagues. As a black woman in a field that wasn't always welcoming to diversity, Tasha had worked twice as hard to prove herself. Today, she was assigned to a case that brought her to a small town for a joint operation between the FBI and local law enforcement. Tasha knew the stakes were high. The operation involved tracking down a dangerous group with ties to organized crime, and every move had to be precise. As she walked into the local police station that morning, she was met with a mix of curiosity and surprise from the officers. She had encountered this before. People were often surprised to see her in a law enforcement role. She learned to ignore the stares and whispers, focusing instead on the task at hand. But today was different. Today, her calm and focused demeanor would soon be tested by someone who would challenge everything she had worked for. Officer Bradson, a local cop in his late 40s, approached her as she was reviewing her case file in the station's break room. He didn't greet her professionally. Instead, he eyed her up and down with a look that made Tasha uncomfortable. She had dealt with bias before, but this felt different. "Are you sure you're cut out for this?" Officer Bradson asked, his tone mocking. "I mean, FBI. You must have gotten the job because of quotas or something." His voice carried enough that others in the room stopped talking and began to listen. Tasha was taken aback, but quickly regained her composure. She had spent years learning how to navigate situations like this. She was used to being underestimated. "I'm here to do my job, just like everyone else," Tasha responded calmly, her voice steady. She turned back to her case file, hoping he would take the hint. But Officer Bradson wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just saying, it's hard to believe someone like you could handle the pressure. You sure you're up for it?" Tasha felt the sting of his words, but she didn't let it show. She had faced much worse in her career, from backhanded compliments to outright discrimination. She had learned early on that letting people like Bradson get under her skin would only work against her. "I've handled plenty of pressure before," Tasha replied, still focused on her work. "I suggest you focus on the task at hand, officer, instead of making assumptions." Bradson didn't seem to appreciate her response. He sneered, leaning in just a little too close. "I'm just making sure you know your place," he said, clearly trying to provoke her. Tasha stood up, feeling the mixture of anger and disappointment. It was one thing to deal with bias privately, but it was something else entirely when it was said aloud, in front of others. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on everything she had worked for. But she knew that losing her cool would only confirm his stereotype of her. "I know exactly where I am," Tasha said, locking eyes with him. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "I'm here to work, just like you, and I'll do it without your approval." Bradson stared at her for a moment, his face reddening with frustration. He had expected her to back down, to show weakness, but Tasha didn't. She didn't need to prove anything to him or anyone else. She knew her worth, and her silence in the face of his words spoke louder than any retort could. After a long pause, Bradson turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Tasha watched him go, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to scream, to tell him everything she had been through to get here, to make him understand how wrong he was. But instead, she took a deep breath, forced herself to relax, and refocused on the task at hand. She was here to do a job, and that was exactly what she was going to do. After the incident with Officer Bradson, Tasha Williams did her best to shake off the lingering frustration. She didn't let it show, especially not to her team. She had a job to do, and the operation wasn't going to wait for her to process what had just happened. She needed to stay focused. Back in her hotel room that evening, Tasha stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her jacket, making sure everything was in place. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, climbing up the ranks of the FBI with her skill, determination, and hard work. She wasn't about to let a moment of disrespect take away her focus. But still, the words Bradson had said echoed in her mind. "You sure you're cut out for this? You sure you're up for it?" It wasn't the first time she had dealt with such comments. She had faced them all throughout her career, and every time she pushed them down and moved forward. But today, something about it felt different. Perhaps it was the boldness of the comment in front of her colleagues, or maybe it was the way Bradson had dismissed her so casually. Whatever it was, it stung. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was her partner, Agent Lucas. He had been working alongside her on the operation and had been completely unaware of the encounter with Bradson. "Tasha, everything's going well for tomorrow's raid," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Are you ready?" Tasha took a deep breath and smiled. "Always ready, Lucas, just focusing on the details." "Good," Lucas replied. "Let's bring this to an end. We've got everything lined up. Tomorrow will be a game changer." The excitement in his voice lifted her spirits. She pushed the thoughts of Bradson to the back of her mind and reminded herself why she was here. They were on the verge of a major breakthrough with their case, one that would bring a dangerous criminal syndicate down and put away people responsible for years of harm. That was her focus now. The next day, the operation began. Tasha and her team gathered in the early morning to go over the final details before the raid. The adrenaline of the mission had always been something she thrived on. But even amidst the excitement, she couldn't shake the lingering weight of the interaction with Bradson. She was determined to finish the job first, but she knew something had to be done about what had happened. During a break in the action, Tasha found herself alone in a quiet corner of the police station. She stared out the window, taking a deep breath, when Agent Lucas walked up to her. He could tell something was off, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply asked, "How's it going? You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Tasha paused for a moment. She had always respected Lucas's ability to read people, even when they didn't say anything. "Just thinking about the case, I guess," she replied. "And well, something else." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" Tasha sighed. "I had an encounter with one of the local officers yesterday. Officer Bradson." Lucas's expression shifted. He had heard rumors about Bradson's reputation, but never thought it would be something his partner had to face directly. "What happened?" Tasha explained, carefully recounting the conversation without letting her anger get the best of her. She told Lucas how Bradson had questioned her qualifications, dismissed her abilities, and made her feel as though she didn't belong in the room. Lucas listened intently, his face hardening as she spoke. "That's not okay," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. No one should ever make you feel like that, especially not someone in law enforcement." Tasha appreciated his words, but she didn't want to dwell on it too long. "It's not about him, Lucas," she said firmly. "I'll deal with it, but right now we have a job to do. Let's focus on bringing this case to a close." The conversation shifted back to the operation as they reviewed their next steps. But in the back of Tasha's mind, she knew that the issue with Bradson wasn't something that would just go away. She had faced challenges before, but this felt like an opportunity to stand up for herself, to set a boundary, and take control of the situation. She wasn't sure what form that would take, but she was determined to find a way to handle it on her terms. For now, though, the operation came first. She wasn't going to let anything distract her from finishing what she had started. The operation was a success. The criminal syndicate was finally taken down, and several key arrests were made. Tasha Williams felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she looked at the progress they had made. This was what she worked for: justice, protection, and making sure the people responsible for hurting others were brought to justice. But despite the success of the operation, something gnawed at her. It wasn't the mission, or even the criminals they had apprehended. It was the lingering feeling from her encounter with Officer Bradson. The thought of what he had said to her, the way he had belittled her, still stung. Tasha had worked too hard for too long to let one person's ignorance get in the way. but at the same time, she couldn't just ignore it. That night, as she sat at her hotel desk, reviewing the case files and reflecting on the mission, Tasha found herself staring at the phone in her hand. She had been thinking about how to address the incident with Bradson. Her instincts told her that confronting him directly would be the best way to handle it. But something inside her told her it needed to be more than just a simple conversation. She needed to make sure this wasn't just brushed aside. It needed to be addressed in a way that not only stood up for her, but also stood as an example of how far things had to go to change. Tasha dressed in a sharp, professional outfit that exuded confidence. She wasn't going to approach this conversation with anger or confrontation. No, she was going to do it on her terms, with grace, and with the same professionalism she brought to every part of her career. At the station, she walked through the front doors and headed directly to the break room. She knew Officer Bradson would be there, as he usually took his break at this time. When she walked in, he was standing near the coffee machine, talking to a few other officers. Tasha took a breath and approached the group. She didn't let her nervousness show. Instead, she stood tall and firm. As soon as Officer Bradson saw her, his face tightened, clearly remembering their last encounter. "I need to speak with you, Officer Bradson," Tasha said, her voice calm but with a firm edge to it. "In private." Bradson gave a slight nod, his posture stiff. The other officers in the room glanced at each other, but didn't say anything as Bradson followed Tasha into a quieter office. Once the door was closed behind them, Tasha turned to him. She didn't raise her voice or make any aggressive moves. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye and began speaking. "Yesterday, you made a comment to me that I want to address," she started, her voice even but strong. "You questioned my qualifications and made assumptions about me based on my race and my gender. That's something I won't ignore, and I won't let slide." Bradson looked uncomfortable, his arms crossed in front of him. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, looking away. Tasha didn't let that deter her. "You may not have meant to offend me, but what you said was harmful. It wasn't just an isolated comment. It's part of a bigger pattern. I've had to work twice as hard to get where I am, and for you to question my place here was disrespectful. Not just to me, but to everyone in this profession." Bradson's expression shifted, and Tasha could see the tension in his face. He was uncomfortable, and for the first time, he seemed to be reflecting on what he had done. He started, but Tasha interrupted, not in anger, but with purpose. "I'm not asking for an apology," she said. "I'm asking for understanding. I want you to think about what you said, not just to me, but to anyone you might have treated the same way. No one should ever feel like they're not worthy or capable because of their race or gender. We have work to do in this field, and it starts with us, being fair to everyone." Tasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. She wasn't looking for a fight. She was looking for a change. For her, this wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Bradson stood still for a moment, his arms uncrossing as he finally met her gaze. I never thought about it like that," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I can see where I went wrong." Tasha nodded. "I appreciate that. Just make sure you remember this the next time you decide to make a judgment about someone." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Bradson standing alone. For Tasha, the confrontation wasn't just about standing up to Officer Bradson. It was about sending a message. She had done what she needed to do, and now she could walk away knowing she had addressed the issue with dignity, and hopefully with a lasting impact. The following days after her confrontation with Officer Bradson were filled with a sense of quiet confidence. Tasha Williams didn't expect an immediate change, nor did she demand one. She had spoken her truth, and that was enough for now. The pressure from the operation had lifted, and now she could focus on the results of the mission, which had been progressing smoothly. But there was something about the way Officer Bradson had looked at her that day, something in his eyes that told her that her words had struck a deeper chord than she had anticipated. He hadn't apologized right away, but there was an undeniable shift in his demeanor. It wasn't immediate, but it felt like a beginning. One morning, as Tasha walked into the local police station to meet with the team for a follow-up on the case, she noticed something different. Officer Bradson was standing near the door, looking almost hesitant, but when he saw her approach, he straightened up. She didn't know what to expect. Was this going to be another awkward interaction, or was he finally ready to admit something? To her surprise, he spoke first. "Agent Williams," he said, his tone quieter than usual. "Can we talk for a minute?" Tasha paused, her hand still on the door handle, ready to enter. She had been expecting the usual tension, maybe even some avoidance, but this was different. He seemed more open, like he was genuinely interested in having a conversation. She nodded, stepping aside to allow him to lead the way into the hallway. "What's on your mind, Officer Bradson?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral, though she was curious. He took a deep breath, looking down at the floor for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," he admitted, "and I've realized that I've been wrong. I let my own assumptions and biases get in the way. You're right. I shouldn't have said what I said, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. I've worked with a lot of people in this field, but I never really took the time to understand what others have to go through." Tasha stood there, her posture relaxed, listening carefully. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she could tell that Bradson wasn't just giving a half-hearted apology. There was sincerity in his voice, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of self-awareness in him. "I've always been the kind of guy who thought things were simple," he continued, his voice slightly rough. "You know, right or wrong, black or white. But I've been thinking about it, and I understand now that there's so much more to it. I'm not perfect, and I've made mistakes, but I want to do better. I want to change how I see things, and how I treat people." Tasha stood still, considering his words carefully. She had faced people who tried to hide behind excuses, who blamed their actions on ignorance or misunderstanding. But this felt different. Officer Bradson wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was acknowledging his own flaws and trying to make things right. It wasn't easy for him, and she knew that. "I appreciate you saying that," Tasha finally replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. This is about changing how we think and act, how we treat each other. You have to keep working on this every day. It's not a one-time thing. And I hope you mean what you're saying, because actions speak louder than words." Bradson nodded quickly, his eyes earnest. "I do. I'll show you through my actions. I promise." For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Tasha could sense that the conversation had done something important. Bradson wasn't just apologizing. He was beginning to see things differently. "Well," Tasha said after a pause, "I've got a lot to get to today. But I'll be keeping an eye on you, officer. You've got a lot to prove, but you've got the chance to make it right. Don't waste it." Bradson gave a small, respectful nod. "I won't. Thank you, Agent Williams." As Tasha walked into the break room to meet her team, she felt a sense of cautious hope. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a step in the right direction. Change didn't come overnight, especially in law enforcement. But maybe, just maybe, Bradson had taken the first step toward becoming a better version of himself. And that was something worth acknowledging. The days that followed Tasha's conversation with Officer Bradson were quieter than usual. But something had shifted, not just in him, but in the entire atmosphere at the police station. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't obvious at first, but there was a noticeable difference in how the officers interacted with Tasha. The subtle glances, the hesitant conversations, and even the respect in their greetings began to feel more genuine. It was as if her stand had started something in motion, even if it was too soon to tell. As she continued working on the case, Tasha focused on her role, always keeping the mission at the forefront of her mind. But as the days passed, the impact of her words to Officer Bradson began to spread. It wasn't just about that one conversation. It was about something larger. A shift in perspective. A slow but growing awareness that actions and words mattered, especially when it came to how people were treated. One morning, as Tasha entered the police station to meet with the local team, she found Officer Bradson standing near the door. She had noticed that he had been more respectful in the days after their talk, but today he seemed different. There was a calmness about him. And when he saw her, he stepped forward, no longer holding back the words he had been carrying. "Agent Williams, I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You were right about everything. The way I treated you, it was wrong, and I see that now." Tasha paused for a moment, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't the first time someone had apologized to her, but there was something different about the sincerity in Bradson's voice. "I'm glad to hear you say that," she replied, her tone steady. "But don't stop there. Keep thinking about it, and keep working to do better." Bradson nodded, clearly understanding that the road ahead wouldn't be as easy as just saying the right words. "I will. I've already started talking to some of the guys about what you said. We need to make sure we're treating everyone the same, no matter who they are." Tasha smiled slightly, a small acknowledgement of the change she had been hoping to see. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was a start. "Good," she said. "Keep pushing for change. You'll see that the more you focus on equality, the better everything will be, for everyone." Over the next few weeks, small changes began to occur. Other officers who had witnessed the conversation between Tasha and Bradson started taking notice of the shift in him. Bradson began speaking out more during team meetings, encouraging his colleagues to focus on fairness in their work and highlighting the importance of treating people with respect, regardless of their background. His words weren't always easy to hear, but they were beginning to make an impact. As more officers began to reflect on their own behaviors, conversations about racial bias and professional conduct started taking place in the break room, in hallways, and during briefings. Tasha overheard these conversations, sometimes quietly, and sometimes with people approaching her for advice. Some officers had never thought about how their actions might affect others, while others began to understand the true power of their words and how those words could shape the way people viewed their work. One afternoon, during a routine meeting with the local team, Tasha was surprised when a senior officer, Officer Harris, spoke up. He had always been quiet and somewhat reserved, but today he was different. "I've been thinking about what we've been discussing," he began, looking directly at Tasha, "and I realize I'd let some things slide, small things that build up over time. I've seen it happening, but I didn't speak up. That changes now." The room fell silent as the other officers looked at each other. Harris wasn't known for making speeches, but his words carried weight. Tasha could feel the shift in the room. They were beginning to understand the importance of addressing these issues head-on. Tasha didn't have to say anything in response. She simply nodded, grateful that the change was starting to take root. It wasn't a perfect system, and the road to progress was long, but the conversation had begun, and that was more than she could have asked for. By the time the operation concluded, Tasha knew that the effects of her encounter with Officer Bradson had gone far beyond one conversation. She had sparked a ripple, a change that was starting to spread through the department, one conversation at a time. And while the work wasn't done, and there was still much to be done to address systemic issues, Tasha felt a sense of quiet pride. She had started something that was bigger than herself, something that could have a lasting impact on the community and the people she worked with. As the days passed after her conversation with Officer Bradson, Tasha couldn't help but notice a subtle shift in the way things were progressing. It wasn't just the change in Bradson or the other officers. It was in the work itself. The operation they had been working on, the one that had brought Tasha into town, was reaching a critical point. They had gathered enough information to finally close in on the criminal syndicate, and the sense of accomplishment was palpable. But as much as she focused on her work, Tasha couldn't fully shake the events with Bradson from her mind. She knew that she had made a significant impact by addressing the issue head-on. Yet she couldn't help but wonder if she had done enough. Her gut told her that change, especially in a place like this, would take more than one conversation or a shift in perspective from one officer. The work, however, had to continue. Justice wasn't about one moment. It was about making sure that every moment led to something lasting. Her thoughts were interrupted one morning when her phone buzzed. It was Agent Lucas, her partner on the case. His message was simple. "Tasha, we've got a lead. We need to move fast." The adrenaline kicked in immediately. Tasha had no time to think about anything else. She grabbed her coat and met Lucas in the briefing room, where their team had already begun preparing for the next phase of the operation. They had received an anonymous tip-off about the location of the syndicate's main hub, and they were ready to act. "Everything's set. We'll hit them hard, and we'll hit them fast," Lucas said, his voice steady and focused. "We've got a small window to get in and out before they can move." Tasha nodded, quickly reviewing the plan. "We do this clean, no mistakes. Everyone knows their roles. We can't afford to get caught." She could feel the tension in the room, but it wasn't the nervous kind. It was the kind of focus that came from years of experience. Everyone was ready. The team knew that this operation could bring down a dangerous network of criminals, and they had no room for error. As the operation unfolded, everything moved like clockwork. The team surrounded the building, their movements swift and calculated. Tasha led the charge with Lucas by her side, making sure each step was precise. They breached the building, arresting key members of the syndicate, but it wasn't until they reached the main office that they hit a snag. One of the suspects, a man with high-level connections to the syndicate, managed to escape through a back door. Tasha's instincts kicked in immediately. She ordered 2 of the officers to pursue him while the rest secured the building. It was a calculated risk, but they couldn't afford to let him slip away. This was the lead they needed to dismantle the entire operation. The pursuit was quick, but it didn't take long before they caught up with the suspect. As Tasha and the team cornered him, they realized that it wasn't just about the arrest anymore. The suspect was holding crucial information that could lead them to the syndicate's leaders, information they had been desperate to find. Tasha stood over the suspect, her expression unwavering. "You have 2 choices," she said, her voice firm. "You cooperate, and we bring you in quietly, or you make this difficult, and we do it the hard way." The suspect looked at her, his eyes filled with fear and defiance. He hesitated, but Tasha could see that he was calculating his options. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I'll talk," he said, his voice low. "But only if you promise me protection." Tasha didn't flinch. "We'll do our part. Now, tell me everything." The information he provided was invaluable. It pointed directly to the heads of the syndicate, and the intelligence he shared allowed the team to piece together the final parts of the puzzle. Within hours, the entire network was compromised, and key figures were arrested. As the operation wound down, and the team began filing back to headquarters, Tasha took a moment to reflect. This operation had been a success, not just because they had taken down the syndicate, but because they had worked together as a team. There had been no distractions, no division. The work had been focused, clear, and efficient. But even with the victory, Tasha knew that this was only one piece of the larger puzzle. The conversation with Officer Bradson had been just one small part of the bigger picture, but it was one that had allowed her to stay true to her mission. Now, as the team celebrated their success, Tasha felt a quiet satisfaction. She had made a difference, and she had done it with grace and purpose. The work was never done, but for today, it felt like a step forward, a step toward real change, not just in the operation, but in the people who had been a part of it. The success of the operation brought relief to Tasha and her team. They had accomplished their goal and taken down a dangerous criminal syndicate. But as Tasha sat in the briefing room with her team, she knew that this was just one victory in a much larger fight. While the mission had been a success, she couldn't forget what had happened before, how she had been treated by Officer Bradson, and the larger issues of prejudice that still lingered in the law enforcement community. Days after the operation, Tasha received an invitation to speak at a community outreach event. It was an annual event organized by the local police department, aimed at building bridges between law enforcement and the community. The event was typically a platform for officers to share their work and showcase their commitment to the public. This year, however, the organizers wanted to focus on the importance of diversity and inclusion within law enforcement, and Tasha had been asked to speak on the subject. At first, she wasn't sure if she wanted to participate. She had spent so much of her career focused on the work itself, not the spotlight. But as she thought about it more, she realized that this was an opportunity, not just for her, but for the people who looked up to her, who saw themselves in her. This could be a chance to speak about her experiences, to help others understand what it meant to be a Black woman in law enforcement, and to challenge the system from the inside. The day of the event arrived, and Tasha stood backstage, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She was ready. The room was packed with community members, law enforcement officers, and local leaders, all eager to hear her speak. The room buzzed with anticipation as the moderator introduced her. When Tasha stepped onto the stage, the room fell quiet. She looked out at the sea of faces in front of her and took a deep breath. This was her moment, not just for her, but for every person who had ever faced discrimination or been underestimated because of their background. "Good evening," Tasha began, her voice steady. "It's an honor to be here tonight, speaking to you all about something that's incredibly important to me: justice, fairness, and equality in law enforcement." She paused, making eye contact with a few of the audience members. "I've spent a lot of my life working in this field. I've faced challenges, yes, but those challenges have made me who I am today. What's more important than the challenges we face, however, is how we choose to overcome them." Tasha's words were calm but filled with conviction. She spoke about the complexities of being a woman of color in a predominantly male, predominantly white field. She shared stories of moments when she had been doubted or overlooked, and how those moments fueled her determination to prove herself. But more than that, she talked about the need for change, not just in how law enforcement treats people of color, but in how they see themselves and each other. "I've been in situations where my skills and abilities were questioned simply because of my race," Tasha continued. "I'm sure many of you have faced similar situations. The way I see it, those of us who face discrimination have two choices. We can either let it define us, or we can turn it into fuel for change." She paused again, her words sinking in. The room was silent, the audience listening intently. But it's not just about personal success. It's about creating an environment where all of us, no matter our race, gender, or background, are treated equally. It's about making sure that we see the value in every individual and treat them with respect, not just in our words, but in our actions. The crowd was visibly moved. Tasha's words resonated deeply with the people in the room, many of whom had never considered the challenges she had faced. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every officer, every community member, and every person who had ever been overlooked or judged unfairly. As she finished her speech, the audience erupted into applause. Tasha stood tall, feeling a deep sense of pride. She had done more than just speak her truth. She had given others the courage to do the same. Later, as the event ended and people began to file out of the room, several officers approached her. One of them, a senior officer who had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, took her hand and said, "Thank you, Agent Williams. You've given me a new perspective. I'll be thinking about what you said for a long time." Tasha smiled, knowing that the real work had just begun. Her words had sparked something in others, something that had the potential to change the future of law enforcement. She knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but she was proud to have played a part in starting that conversation. The weeks following Tasha's speech at the community outreach event were filled with a sense of purpose. She had spoken her truth, and the ripple effects were undeniable. People were talking about her words, And more importantly, they were starting to understand the deeper issues she had highlighted. Her message about fairness, respect, and equality in law enforcement was slowly taking root, not just among the public, but within the police department as well. Tasha knew that change, especially in an institution as large as law enforcement, didn't happen overnight. But every step forward felt like a victory, and every conversation, no matter how small, felt like progress. Officer Bradson had come to her after the speech, expressing his gratitude once more. This time, he wasn't just apologizing. He had begun seeking out resources, attending workshops on bias and diversity, and even encouraging others to do the same. While it was clear that not all officers were on the same path, Tasha could feel the shift. The conversations about racial bias, equality, and fair treatment were no longer just whispers in the corners of the station. They were being discussed openly in meetings, and more officers were speaking up about their own experiences and what they had learned. Tasha had always believed that change had to come from within. She had seen firsthand how people could grow when given the right tools and support. And that was exactly what she was doing, helping create the kind of environment where growth and understanding were encouraged. She was slowly but surely helping to reshape the culture of the department. One day, while she was reviewing case files, Tasha received a message from Officer Harris, the senior officer who had spoken up during the meeting after her speech. He had taken the time to reflect on what she said and was now leading a small group of officers in discussions about racial bias and reform. They were planning to implement regular training sessions to ensure that officers understood the impact of their words and actions. "I know we have a long way to go, but we're making a difference," Officer Harris wrote in his message. "Thank you for starting the conversation. We're all better for it." Tasha felt a sense of pride. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had taken on this fight in the first place. She wasn't just in law enforcement to make arrests or solve cases. She was there to make sure everyone, no matter their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. She was part of a movement to change the system from the inside out, and while it was a long road, she could see the progress and the small but important steps being taken. As her career continued, Tasha was offered a position to help develop training programs for new recruits in the FBI. The opportunity was a dream come true for her. She had spent years working in the field, and now she could use her experience to shape the next generation of law enforcement officers. It wasn't just about teaching them how to solve crimes. It was about teaching them how to lead with integrity, fairness, and respect for all people. She also started working more closely with community leaders, building stronger relationships between law enforcement and the people they served. The more she worked with the community, the more she realized how much her efforts were appreciated. People were beginning to trust law enforcement again, seeing that there were officers who genuinely cared about them and their well-being. Over time, Tasha became a role model for others, both within the department and outside it. Young women of color, in particular, looked up to her as someone who had broken through barriers and proved that they too could succeed in law enforcement. Tasha never took her position for granted. She knew that every decision she made had the potential to inspire someone else to follow in her footsteps. And yet, despite all the success and change she had helped create, Tasha remained humble. She knew that the work wasn't over. There would always be challenges, but she was more determined than ever to continue fighting for fairness, equality, and justice in law enforcement. For Tasha, this was just the beginning. As she stood on the steps of the police station one evening, looking out at the community she had worked so hard to serve, Tasha felt a quiet satisfaction. The work was never done, but with every conversation, every action, and every person who joined her in this fight, change was happening. And that was enough for her. She had made a difference, and that difference would continue to grow.